Hello from New Zealand, Richard Miller, roving reporter. Wow, been through so many things just in a few short weeks here, and last night was no different. We're in this little town south of Motueka. Motueka's on the way to Golden Bay. Golden Bay, I haven't even made it over there. There's just so much in the Nelson area, and who knows, I'm going out of my skin here, really. I can't really tell you how New Zealand is. I mean, I really couldn't do a travel log or really just show you how contained it is and how beautiful it is and what a unity it is. Something about it is like, I don't know, you've watched Lord of the Rings, and I guess that, and we're not even in Lord of the Ring country, you know, that's in the South Island, but farther. It's just so fantastic, so amazing. And, you know, the consciousness of the people, they're open, they want to know. And they're not quite as resigned or not quite as complacent, maybe. Well, maybe they are, but the ones I'm finding. And, you know, we're trying to be practical. We're trying to talk about spiritual matters. We're trying to talk about the essence of life. People call that spiritual. And we're trying to understand, really, what motivates good living and taking care of each other and good relationships. And so then we're looking everywhere we can to inquire and discover. And last night I met Nicole Foss. And welcome so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming here. And actually I'm with you, you know, I'm at a house where you're staying. And wow, I've been so interested in what you've been talking about in the economy, because back in September we were at the Occupy, and we were going to Occupy Chicago, and we were listening to Occupy Wall Street and trying to understand, you know, why does it seem like our civilization is fragile?
Well, it seems that the civilization is fragile because it really is at the peak of a bubble. And I think people have a sense that something is profoundly wrong, that things cannot continue, that we're on a path that's taking us somewhere that can be dangerous. So this is really what happens with a bubble. Things superficially look very good, but people tend to have a sense that there's something rotten in the foundations. And there really is, because when you have a bubble, you create the perception of an enormous amount of wealth, the perception of a large, robust framework. But really there's no structure to it. It's hollowed out over time, so that it tends to implode. And we've seen bubbles many, many times before in history. They go back to antiquity. So they're nothing new. They're very much a manifestation of human nature at the scale of civilization.
Well, what is a bubble? Is it like just enthusiasm? Or let's explain a little bit about how it works, that things... Bubble just means that, okay, it's got air in it, so that it means something without substance, or without much substance, is somehow stimulating the other part that has substance. Something like that?
Well, what happens over time is that people catch a fever, if you like, a speculative fever. So they start bidding up the price of assets, and the confidence really allows liquidity to flow. So you end up with a lot more liquidity in the system, a lot more purchasing power. It ends up being an era of inflation when the money supply is increasing relative to available goods and services. So prices rise, people start bidding up the price of assets in advance of the fundamentals. They create virtual value. So you have the same asset, say a house, that people simply agree over time must be worth more and more and more. And so there's virtual value that's added onto any kind of real value that the house might have. And of course, the same thing goes for all other asset classes, anything that's been financialized. So stocks and commodities and bonds and gold and silver and very many things, apart from houses and land, have been in a bubble. So the bidding up of prices over time creates a layer of virtual value that has no substance. And the assumption is that it doesn't matter what you pay for something because someone else will always pay more later. So people throw caution to the wind. They throw their newfound purchasing power at asset prices. They push them up until you reach the most aggressive speculator. Then the whole thing goes into reverse and the virtual value disappears. So over a period of several years, in the case of a housing market, or perhaps much quicker than that in the case of derivatives, the virtual value disappears and you go back to something approximating perhaps the underlying value of the asset. But all the part of it that had no substance is completely ephemeral. It disappears and you go back a long, long way in terms of asset prices.
So you say you go back to what maybe the value is, but in other words, well, actually you overshoot it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's always an undershoot. So
then.
you have a period of speculative excess. You start at whatever level you start at. You go up to a peak, then it falls, and it will actually go down to below the asset prices when the bubble dynamic actually started to get underway. So there's always that period of undershoot before you can start to recover again. And in our case, the bubble has lasted 30 years at least. And so the undershoot is taking us back to before the
30
era
years,
of
right?
Yes.
So anyhow, like we're kind of like jump right into the discussion speaking about, the current situation, what's here now, but maybe, I don't know, can we try to just really lay this up from the ground up and say, like, what is value? What is the nature of value? What is monetary exchange? And just try to look at some real basics, because, I mean, if we want to get out of the system that we're in that is kind of abusing us in a way, we have to kind of look back and lay a foundation of, like, in other words, you said, well, it'll get back to the value that things have, but really any value is just a perception, isn't it? I mean, what do things have? What value do things have?
It is a perception. So it's very hard to say that anything has an objective value, although you can say that some things have more value than others, like a home, for instance, that has value as shelter will always have more value than something like a derivative contract that has no basis in reality at all. That is, derivatives are simply bets on the price movements of underlying assets. So you don't have real value in something like a derivatives contract. Things that have real, tangible, physical value because of their utility are going to still maintain that value. As to what monetary value we would put on that, that is always going to be somewhat arbitrary. It's going to depend on the circumstances.
Well, I mean, the way we're organized in actually the civilized world right now on planet Earth, market determines value. So then we've got the forces of who wants something, and then who makes something or who has it, right? The seller and the buyer. And of course, well, just look at army surplus, I mean, you can buy tanks maybe for nothing, for the value of the scrap iron. And yet they still work, right? Because they're obsolete or somehow. Anything, anything that is not used anymore is just, and that's the whole idea. In other words, okay, like we were talking on the market, but we're also talking about money. Now we could say money has value, it measures value. But in another way, if something is abundant, it has less value because you can get it everywhere. Everyone's, it's a seller's market, right? Or a buyer's market, right? And so then money doesn't really nail down a value either.
No, it doesn't. And it's all to do with perception anyway. So we perceive relative values. They do change over time, as you said, depending on what is scarce, what people want at any given time. So the value of food is incredibly high. If someone is hungry enough, they'll trade gold coins for food. They may trade all kinds of hard assets for food if they're hungry enough. So it depends what is scarce, what is abundant. Things that are everywhere, simply there for the picking up, are not going to have value. Things that are scarce and very useful will have value. Money is our artificial means of placing relative values on things. But during periods of upheaval, those relative values are subject to change over quite short periods of time. So it isn't going to be clear what exactly is going to have what relative value in comparison to other things. There are certain things that we can suggest in terms of movements towards greater value for the essentials because they're more likely to be scarce, whereas there's going to be less value for things that are trinkets, that are optional, that we don't have to have, the toys that we've produced in the bubble years.
Sometimes I think that, you know, money is like I've started to say money is a distribution system because it's how we move things back and forth, right? Mm-hmm. And then I noticed that money as a distribution system is dependent totally on scarcity, because anything that's abundant can't be traded. Now, it could be like herbal remedies, right? In other words, patent medicine is something that's traded because people feel that there's an advantage to building a structure to trade that because they somehow own the rights to it. But plants, I mean, you could just grow your own, right? Nobody can say, don't grow this plant. I guess they can.
Well, they do try to control that sort of thing. A lot of the food legislation is about trying to take control over the means of production of food and the exchange of seeds. So here in New Zealand, for instance, there's a food bill that is being voted on that would take away effectively food security and the right to exchange seeds. It's very much about defending property rights and preventing people from being able to simply do their own thing and not have to pay into the system. Because if you can establish exclusive rights to something, you can extract rents from that.
Right, then it can work with money, right?
Yes.
Is seeds just about GMOs then, genetically modified? Because somehow you have to have a patent on a seed, and then you say, oh, that seed, you go into somebody's field and say, oh, it's got my DNA is in there, and so it must be my seed or a derivative of my seed, so you owe me.
A lot of the food legislation is really being driven by big agriculture companies, and it's in their interests to narrow biodiversity to the point where it's really their seeds that are being used for crops. Now, these might be terminator seeds, so that it might not be any point in saving any, because you won't get another generation from them anyway. Even if you could, even if they're not terminator seeds, you're not allowed to save seed and grow the next year. You have to constantly pay and pay and pay. But what has happened with these seeds, apart from all the problems of genetic modification in that you have seeds that produce insecticides that then people are eating, or you have seeds that are resistant to herbicides so that you can soak the field in herbicides, and then you end up eating herbicide residues. These don't kill the plant.
Roundup Ready soybeans,
well,
right?
Exactly. So apart from the issues of all the additional levels of potential toxicity that you introduce, what you also do is narrow biodiversity, and you end up with crops that are incredibly dependent on expensive inputs, fertilizers and pesticides, perhaps high levels of irrigation depending on the crop. So you build in expensive inputs, and then you create a situation where only people who have a sufficient amount of wealth can actually use those seeds, because only people who have a certain amount of money are able to afford the inputs that the seeds require. So what you force is concentration of ownership of farmland, because subsistence farmers can't afford the inputs. Often they're told, well, you must grow these seeds, they're wonderful yield, this is what you really need to be doing. But when they do that, they find that it puts them out of business because they can't afford the inputs. They end up being tenants on what was once their own land. So that concentration of ownership and the monetization of agriculture that comes with it is a very efficient means for extracting surpluses from people further down the financial food chain than you are. So if you look at companies like Monsanto, it is in their interests to control and monetize agriculture down to the smallest possible level. The very bottom level you can't realistically monetize, so you drive people like that off the land, and then they end up with no control over any resources at all, concentrate ownership, monetize the system, and then you can very efficiently extract the surpluses. So this is very much a centralization of control kind of model that is undermining food security for millions and millions of people worldwide. And really, even going back to the Green Revolution, that's what a lot of it was about. Narrow biodiversity, give control to larger players. What you really need in the world is all the original biodiversity of the crops that were bred to grow in particular areas that might have been drought resistant, pest resistant, that give you a basis in biodiversity that you could then take through plant breeding programs in all sorts of different directions, depending on local circumstances. That is not accidentally being lost, it is being actively thrown away. If you allow people to maintain control, then you can't monetize, you can't cream off the surpluses, so you take away that level of control. Now, I think what we have to do is to reclaim that level of control by moving away from centralization. So the impulses to centralization are very strongly there, but I think we can actually undermine centralization by simply taking back control and decentralizing ourselves en masse, so that what we're trying to achieve can't realistically be prevented.
You know, I just want to mention that, like last night, you were talking about energy, and you were saying the fraction of energy that's needed to produce that energy. In other words, at one time we could put 1 in the ground and get out 100 worth of energy, and now maybe if we can put 5 in the ground, or like 1 in the ground and get 5 energies out instead of 100, and then you're saying the same thing with food, right? Because like you need all those inputs, so then there's some kind of a calorie ratio there of you have to put calories in as pesticides and fertilizers and so on, and then the calories you get out is 1 to 1 instead of 1 to 100 or something, right?
Far worse than that.
Oh yeah?
You put 10 calories in for every 1 you get out.
Oh my God.
In industrial agriculture. It's the least energy efficient food system ever in existence on the face of the earth. Imagine if we were lions and we were chasing gazelles and we had to put in 10 units of energy for every 1 we got out if we caught something. It wouldn't last for very long, would we? The only reason we can do this is because we've had access to cheap fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are such a tremendous boost to what people are capable of that we've actually developed a system that depends on being able to throw in cheap energy, 10 times as much cheap fossil fuel energy as we get out in the form of food energy. So in energy terms, our agriculture system is absolutely pathological. It cannot continue. There's simply no way, when we lose access to fossil fuels, when the net energy of energy production declines to a very low ratio, we are not going to be able to do that anymore. So we must change the form of agriculture that we practice. We must go back to something that produces a genuine surplus. So for a long time, agriculture hasn't had to be about energy surpluses in the way that it always was prior to the Industrial Revolution. Now we must go back to agriculture being about producing an energy surplus, which means that there is no way under the sun that we can do it in the way that we have been doing it with industrial scale agriculture. We must go back to local biodiversity and a lot more human labor. That is the only way that agriculture can continue to produce food as cheap fossil fuels become scarce.
In a way, we'll need the fossil fuels because we need to make nitrogen, right? So we need that organic material, that petroleum. And then in order not to run out of fossil fuels, I guess we have to move to other energy sources for our heating and cooling and transport and so on.
Well, you're right that, yes, nitrogen and fossil fuels are very much related. It's actually natural gas more than petroleum. So artificial fixation of nitrogen using natural gas as a feedstock. And 40% of the nitrogen in the food supply comes from the artificial fixation of nitrogen. Prior to the ability to do that, nitrogen was always the limiting factor in terms of crop yields. So what we've done with fossil fuels is artificially inflated carrying capacity. The number of people, or the amount of biomass that can be supported by a given amount of soil, we have artificially inflated that, both with the artificial fixation of nitrogen and also all the fossil fuel inputs to do with having one person be able to work thousands of acres of land with tractors and all sorts of big equipment. So that's increased yields, but at the expense of moving us into this extremely energy dependent, energy inefficient form of food production. We are not going to be able to continue to artificially inflate carrying capacity in an energy constrained future. So that is inevitably going to limit crop yields, as well as limit our ability to move food production around. So we are going to have major problems with access to food in the future. That's probably going to be the number one longer term problem. So the initial problem is not having any money to afford things. So whatever there may be, if people can't afford it, then that ends up being your limiting factor for the next few years. Beyond that, it's going to be energy. And beyond that, it's absolutely going to be food, the ability to produce food and distribute food. That's going to cause major periods of upheaval in parts of the planet. Not everywhere is equally over carrying capacity, but nevertheless, in a system that's quite global, where for the time being people can be reasonably mobile, we are going to see knock-on effects from food shortages carry around the world. The effects will be felt in many places.
What's the alternative, the natural fixation of nitrogen? That just happens with, I think I've heard it like they plant soybeans and a certain kind of fungus goes on the root, and that fungus fixes nitrogen in the soil, and it's a slow process, right? So that would really be a setback if we only had to depend on that, right?
Yes, one of the major problems that we have is that apart from all the other things we've discussed about industrial agriculture that are harmful, agriculture of any kind, whether it's industrial or not, actually strip mines soil fertility. So what you do with agricultural systems is you clear away a natural ecosystem that's very diverse, that has an inbuilt food web. You clear it all away. You put in a monocrop. So you put in one form of food crop that you then turn almost entirely into additional human biomass. This system strip mines soil fertility. You are constantly withdrawing nutrients from the soil and not replacing them. Now, some systems are better than others. If you have systems that have fallow periods and crop rotation, you plant nitrogen fixers at one point, then you plant other things. You can keep it going a lot longer. There are ways of doing it that you don't strip mine, but certainly a lot of the agricultural practices that have been used in the past, and even more so the intensive ones we use now, take away nutrients all the time, so that the only way you can continue to grow food in these areas is with the use of artificial fertilizers, chemical fertilizers that are energy-based, that we have to have access to cheap energy in order to produce. If we could no longer do that, what we might realize in various parts of the world is we have strip mined soil fertility to the extent that we would now be having to farm on subsoil. Subsoil does not have the fertility that topsoil has. So when you take away the topsoil, you are killing the biodiversity in the soil microflora that really does provide an enormous amount of the fertility of that soil, very much including the fixation of nitrogen. So there are nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil that are capable of transforming atmospheric nitrogen into forms of nitrogen that plants can access. Now, the real problem with nitrogen, this is two nitrogen atoms with a triple bond in between them. That's atmospheric nitrogen, N2. Triple bonds are very hard to break. In other words, it takes a lot of energy to be able to break the bond between the two nitrogen atoms and then take those nitrogen atoms and turn them into nitrates or nitrites and various other nitrogen compounds and proteins. So if you're having to have step number one be to break a chemical triple bond to turn it into a form that's usable, this is always going to be challenging for life, for energy consumption artificially. You have to put quite a lot in to do that. That's why nitrogen was always a major limiting factor. So if we compromise the natural ability to do that, the way that soil bacteria do, then we definitely have a problem. We do find that we compromise soil fertility. If you look at agricultural systems of the past, you look at, say, what was once the Fertile Crescent. This was the cradle of civilization. What is it now? It's the desert in Iraq. So really that was the result of ancient agriculture, ancient overproduction. A lot of forms of agriculture leave deserts in their wake. They compromise soil fertility to the point where you can't grow anything there again for potentially thousands of years. So it's not that you can quickly recover from that kind of circumstance. And what people would have done in the past, if they were leaving deserts in their wake, is they would have gone somewhere else where they hadn't done that yet, and the cycle would repeat. But part of the problem we face now is we've gone everywhere. So there isn't anywhere else we can go to repeat the cycle. Now people are going to end up left in the places that are already depleted. So where carrying capacity is already damaged and you take away the ability to prop it up artificially, then you can have a problem really quite quickly. And food access is going to be a major problem over the next 100 years. The carrying capacity of the Earth is not 7 billion people. We don't know exactly what it is, but it's substantially less than that. We've probably overshot carrying capacity, even if you look at it in terms of the artificially inflated carrying capacity given us by fossil fuels. When we don't have access to anything like the amount of energy that we did before, that carrying capacity will be much lower. And when you have 7 billion people trying to live where carrying capacity might be 1 or 2 billion, then what are they going to do to that remaining carrying capacity on the way down? If you look at places like Haiti, where people have cut down all the trees to make charcoal.
That's about the worst, isn't it? One of the worst.
Yes, you can see the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic from space, because on the Haitian side of the island of Hispaniola, they've cut down all the trees. So this is what people can do when there are far too many people for the amount of land that they're trying to live on. They can enormously damage the remaining carrying capacity, which then makes the problem far worse, because you've still got a lot of people there, and now the land can support even fewer than it did before. So when you cut down all the trees, the soil washes away from the hills, you have enormous erosion of what soil had built up over thousands and thousands of years. Then you have less soil fertility, you can't grow the same things, plus you're exposed to mudslides and all kinds of other catastrophes. So Haiti is today what many other parts of the world could be tomorrow. Not literally tomorrow, but a few decades hence, there might be many parts of the world that look like Haiti. It really is part of the tragedy of our times. When you have a period where you artificially prop things up and you have a huge growth curve in the short term, the price for that is always a sharp fall. Whether you're talking about asset prices in the financial world, or access to energy, or the ability to sustain population, you end up with the same problem every time. When you have an exponential rise, you tend to have a very sharp readjustment, a very sharp fall on the other side. And then you have to recover from something where you've had an undershoot. So you have your parabolic rise and a sharp fall. Financial bubbles and population both have the same curve. So you look at an undershoot and then where you might start to be able to grow again from at what point you might end up. But if you start to think of the implications, they are really quite significant, to put it mildly. So we at the Automatic Earth, we don't just write about finance, although we are a finance site. We are big picture people, very much incorporating energy and population, carrying capacity, geopolitics, a whole range of subjects. And we really do need to understand all of them in a reasonable amount of depth in order to know how to integrate them and know what will be the most important factor at any given time and how all these factors interact. And often they have additive effects on each other. So the big picture is really the important thing at the moment.
In a way, I wanted to kind of see if I could get to something really, really basic, and maybe we'll get there later, like what is economic activity really, how did it really come about? And but anyhow, at a certain point, people owned things, and then there was assets, right? I suppose if you lived in a paradise and wherever you threw in a fish net, you pulled out a fish, you wouldn't really have to have any possessions or have any line or land or have anything really. You would just move around.
If there are few enough people compared to the amount of space and the amount of resources, you really don't need property rights. because there's plenty to go round.
It's ridiculous, right? Who would want to stay there? Because you're just in the nomadic populations. Well, anyhow, the ones that were, I don't know, maybe in South America or somewhere that were like more paradise, like the Polynesian Islands or something. And I mean, who would want to have land, you know? Because, I mean, the land is everywhere.
You don't have to own it under those circumstances. So when you have a very small population compared to the resource base, people can simply move around and help themselves to whatever they need, wherever they are, and they don't have to establish a base. Part of the problem with establishing a base is that then you have to deal with what is your reach from that base. Well, if you're walking, it's a certain distance. If you have other forms of transport, it might be slightly further, but nevertheless, that base will define what kind of area you are working with. And then it will also come to be where your wastes all end up.
Yeah, your waste, and you know, when you need to follow your resources somehow and let them recover, and then move on, and then 10 years later, when you come back there as a tribe or whatever, you know, I mean, everything is back to nature, especially in a tropical rainforest where it grows back so quickly, and. But anyhow, if we fast forward, then all of a sudden we've got ownership, and then we get into trading, right? Because we have more of this, and you have more of that, and let's switch it back and forth. So then we get into something that we have now is markets. You know, I mean, there were primitive markets, but the thing about markets is that they change, right? I mean, there's a fluctuation, up and downness, and so then again, fast forward into like the Great Depression, you know. I mean, and there's, like we talked about, there's these ups and downs, and well, even before that, I mean, I think they always had market cycles, and so then what we call bubble is kind of like man's attempt to control these market cycles and inject a little air, inject a little something into a stimulus, inject a stimulus into a depressing market, and then kind of extract some kind of put the brakes on an overbearing market that's going too high. And so then we get into try to explaining what a bubble is and why, you know, what are these mechanisms that were historically used to stimulate and to depress a market. So,
essentially, the model you describe is negative feedback. If something's getting too far in one direction, you take some kind of action that will push it back. And the suggestion is that there's some kind of equilibrium, some kind of happy medium. And when things go one way, they will naturally, for one reason or another, tend to move back. Actually, I don't regard that as being a description of the way the world works. I would say the world is based on positive feedback, where you have things move in a particular direction until they cannot anymore. You have these sharp rises where people are piling into a particular market. And what happens is when prices rise, people buy, so prices rise more, so more people buy and prices rise more. That's positive feedback, not negative. It's not taking you towards equilibrium. It's in fact fundamentally destabilizing. So it takes you into a direction as far as you can go until you can no longer go any further. Then you have these sharp corrections. And what that looks like in terms of markets is the tug of war between hope and fear that plays out at all degrees of trend simultaneously. So markets are patterned in a fractal way. This is a fundamentally different model than you would normally see. I think the idea of equilibrium and negative feedback models is really suggesting that we have a level of control that we fundamentally do not have. So people who say, well, we must just be counter-cyclical, and if the economy is depressed, as long as we stimulate it enough, we have the control to prevent that depression from manifesting. Or if things are getting out of hand to the upside, then we'll simply take away the punch bowl and it'll all be fine. It doesn't work that way.
But haven't they always, like raised the interest rate when inflation got too high, and they'd say, well, because there's different segments of the population. Some people, inflation helps, and other people it hurts. People on fixed incomes, retired people that have fixed expenses, inflation hurts, and so then just saying, okay, well, it'll be 4% a year of inflation or something like that. And isn't that true that they would raise interest rates to cool the market?
Governments don't set interest rates. The market sets interest rates. Governments decide what rate they're prepared to defend. if you're trying to defend a rate that's radically different from what the market is asking for the risk premium that the market is asking for, you just bankrupt your country. So if you look at the way rates move, they follow the rates that the market is setting. So this is quite clear with the Fed funds rate, for instance. This is following the rate, the interest premium that the market is asking for.
So then you're saying the Fed is not really controlling the interest rate. In other words, they're just following it and trying to follow it the best they can, because that's it. That's all they can do, right?
Yes, that is the way it works. Interest rates are a risk premium. So interest rates will be high at a time when people feel that the possibility of being repaid is less than it was. And the interest rates will be low when people are not asking for a higher risk premium. So what you end up with is periods where the market will be asking for high risk premiums, like in Greece today, and periods where it's asking for a low risk premium. If you look at the United States today, the interest rates are very, very low, despite the clearly unsustainable finances in the United States. But all you have to be is the least worst option. The money will go from where the fear is to where the fear is not. Right now, there's a tremendous amount of fear in the European periphery, so the interest rates are going through the roof. And this, of course, generates a self-fulfilling prophecy of default, because if the interest rates are going up, then because the risk of default is perceived to be higher, those higher interest rates will make it harder to service the debt. So if the rate of default was high before, it is now higher as the interest rates have gone up. But because the rate of the potential for default is now higher, you put the interest rates up again to compensate for the now higher level.
So that's what you call positive feedback, right?
Exactly. So you have a period where fear generates self-fulfilling prophecies. And money will go from where something like that is taking place, where that psychological spiral is taking place, to wherever there is not the perception of fear. So right now, there's the perception that the United States will never default on its debt. Personally, I think that's a mistaken perception. If you look at debt to GDP in the United States, it's getting on for 400%. And in fact, if you included all the unfunded liabilities like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, it would be in excess of 650%. So that's clearly past the point of no return. That debt will not ultimately be repaid, but because there's a perception at the moment that it's the lowest risk, or one of the lowest risks, money is flooding into the United States on a knee-jerk flight to safety into the reserve currency.
But I mean, debt is, it seems like it's so clear that debt can't be repaid that you have to assume that debt is not intended to be repaid. It's some kind of an expansion and contraction device that works the money system. And it's just a float fund in a way. It's not really something that'll ever be repaid.
Yes, really the point, from the point of view of the banking system, is for people to get into an amount of debt that they can't repay, but that they can somehow perpetually service. In other words, the banking system, the financial system, is acting as a parasite. And what it wants to do is have, in an ideal world, it would have a situation where it was constantly able to remove debt servicing payments. But the problem is that the parasite is about to kill the host, because you end up in a position where it's not possible to service the debt anymore. When you can no longer service the debt, you end up with that debt being defaulted upon instead. And then you can't extract the surpluses. Of course, at that point, what they will try and do is reach for the actual collateral. So places like Greece, for instance, are being actively asset stripped at the moment. They're about to default on their debt. If you can't continually extract debt service payments, the next thing you would do is go and claim the real physical assets. So the end game of fractional reserve banking is that the bankers own everything. They lend money into existence in order to generate the right to claim debt servicing payments, and then at the end of the day, when the debt can no longer be serviced, they end up owning all the assets as well.
Not exactly does that always work. You mentioned that last night. You said that the banks are not all that great at taking care of their assets. And there's 2 foreclosures on the street that I live in the outside of Chicago, and our sewer's not all that good. on our street, and so people took water in the basement twice in 1 year and once the next year, which was last summer. And that place had been foreclosed on, and the water stayed in the basement for maybe a month or so, and or more, until it just drained out. I don't know. And the whole place gets moldy. So then basically it's a tear down.
Yes, I mean, banks don't want to own small assets like homes. That's more trouble to look after than it's worth. So if they foreclose, what tends to happen is the place sits empty, no one's looking after it, might well be stripped of all the copper piping, and eventually have to everything. Right. And it might well eventually have to be torn down. The kind of assets they're more interested in owning are the very big ones, especially things that have some kind of income stream associated with them because they provide some kind of essential service. But the system really doesn't pay sufficient attention to the most basic infrastructure, because often it is things, as you say, like sewer pipes, like water pipes, the very basic things, the ability to keep bridges from falling down. These things don't tend to be high profile, the sort of assets bankers would be interested in managing, or any such thing. But if you don't manage them, if you don't invest in them and look after them, the consequences for all of society end up being really quite extreme. There are quite a lot of parts of the world where the clock started ticking on basic infrastructure like sewage pipes in the Victorian era, because that's when they were built, and there hasn't been anywhere near enough investment in them since. So eventually, a lot of that basic infrastructure will end up collapsing, and much of it is already at or well past its design life. We don't have the money anymore to repair what we built in that era, because at that time we had a lot more surplus wealth. There was a lot more margin in the system. Now we are larger, but we're more brittle. We have fewer safety margins, and we no longer have the ability to even maintain what the Victorians were able to build. So we're already getting ourselves into a major problem, where we're going to find that the potential for infrastructure collapse could completely undermine our ability to do things the way we're used to doing them, to be able to get around on roads that don't crack up, and to be able to have water come to our houses, to have sewage leave. These are very, very basic functions. You can't live at the scale of civilization without being able to attend to these functions. So if you lose the ability to provide for that at least some very basic level, people would no longer be able to live at that scale of civilization. You would inevitably find people moving out more into country places, but often these are people who haven't the faintest idea how to live in the country and what to do with a patch of land, even if they have one. So again, you end up with major problems of making the adjustment from where we are with our incredible range of structural dependencies to where we're going, which is that we will not have any of the things that we are currently structurally dependent upon. And the period of transition from here to there is going to be a profoundly uncomfortable one.
It'll be kind of like a big surprise. You know, we demonize banks, and so then I would like to kind of, again, go back a little farther and say, well, okay, we were talking about an idyllic time when fish were jumping out of every river, right, and berries were on every bush. And then we said later, when more people got there, or when they moved somewhere where that wasn't so friendly, they had to start owning land and owning things, owning properties and owning rights and owning. And so a group of, you know, like a class of people that own assets seem to develop and separate themselves from a class of people that didn't own assets, and somehow were actually the ones that were stripped of those assets. In other words, we were all born of the earth, and so in a way we all inherit the earth, but some of us have taken the earth from others and said, okay, you don't have the earth, but you can rent from us. And so then this whole idea of ownership, you know, sometimes it goes pretty far, especially when you're talking about patents and copyrights and, you know, seeds and things like that, you know, that seem like they really should, well, even people that own forestry rights, or that own timber rights, or mineral rights, or water power rights, or all these things that they didn't make, drilling rights, coal rights, mining rights. They didn't make all this stuff in the earth, and in a way we're all should inherit that, but yet we've separated that all off, and then we've created a class of people that have a surplus, and we call that wealth, right? And so then that whole wealth is saying, well, what are we going to do with our wealth? You know, well, we can celebrate it and build mansions and so on, or we can, you know, we could buy precious things. You know, that doesn't really get us very far. We could wallpaper our walls with stock certificates. That doesn't get us so far. So then they said, aha, we'll put it in a bank. And then a bank has to do something with that, do something with my wealth and make it bigger, right? And so then they do it with three means that I know. I mean, they get dividends on stocks, they get rents on properties, and well, it's just rent taking, I guess, is what the economists talk about, right? And then we think that wealth and liquidity is important for society, because if we want to build a bridge or something, we have to have some kind of a liquidity. So then that wealth is important. We stimulate it with lower tax rates on wealth than on labor, and so then this wealth thing is something that we used to think was really important, and I guess a lot of people that have it still think it's really important. But in a way, all those rents and dividends and so on that wealth earns are monies that are taken out of the loop of society. You said that I spend my money and that's your income, and you spend your money and that's my income, and then we just keep looping money and the velocity of money. So then wealth takes money out of the system, and so then that's why the bank is charged with doing something with that wealth, right?
What you have when you scale up civilization, you go beyond the plenty around for everyone and just pick it off the nearest tree, and you create larger aggregations of people. You inevitably increase socioeconomic complexity. You end up with more and more differentiation of roles in society. So you end up with more in the way of hierarchy. The ability for those at the top to be able to cream off layers of surpluses from everyone further below them. So that is a function of scale. When you scale up human society, this inevitably happens. You get a larger group of people at the bottom who are doing the primary labor, and then the people higher up, merchant classes, are bringing in surpluses, and the people at the very top of the pyramid end up with the ultimate ability to cream off surpluses. They end up with the most claims to resources, if you like, the most abstract kinds of wealth. So this is simply a function of scale. Any time you have the ability to concentrate energy to build civilization, you are going to get much greater development of socioeconomic complexity. And ultimately that does lead to things like banking, and then all the mechanisms that bankers use to financialize the wealth conveyance from the periphery in favor of the center. Because if you can financialize it, it's much more efficient to cream off surpluses than it is if you're looking at creaming off physical surpluses.
Let's just explain a little bit about creaming off surpluses, because I mean there's two things: that I can make money, or not even money. I can subsist on my labor, right? Somehow I have two hands and 2 feet, and I can do things with them, and maybe I have a machine and I can do things with that, and somehow that brings something to me that I can eat and live on, right, and clothe myself with. And then everyone is kind of equal in that. You know, some have got college degrees and stuff, but you know, you only got 24 hours in a day, and you got to sleep sometime. But then the other part is this wealth thing that is like getting rents for me, because I own properties. You know, it's getting, you know, it's getting profits from my companies, all my companies, and it's getting dividends from all my stocks and papers and bonds and stuff. I'm getting interests.
Wealth generates more wealth.
Yeah.
Which is another
and
cycle of positive
that's the
feedback.
way that we cream off with the wealth is what's really creaming off from others.
One thing that's important to note, though, when we look at bankers, and this is one of the reasons that we say don't demonize people, don't look for scapegoats and say this is all the fault of certain people. if we think about how we look at bankers, because they are creaming off surpluses from us, and then they try and maintain that wealth disparity between them and us. And by us, I mean, middle class people in the developed world. If we think of the way we look at bankers, we need to be aware of the fact that most of the rest of the world looks at us in exactly the same way that we look at bankers. Because we are part of the center. Being in the developed world, we are the beneficiaries of sucking wealth from the rest of the world, from the much broader periphery. So we are not at the base of the pyramid, really. If you look globally,
Yeah.
we're well up that pyramid.
Right.
And we are also trying to maintain the disparity between us and the further periphery. So when we look in the developed world and we say we are the 99% and they are the 1%, I would say, well, maybe they're the 0.1%, we're the 10%, and the 90% is everybody else in the world whose function is to provide surpluses for us to cream off and benefit from. So I think we have to take a broader view and realize that we're part of a system that we have actually acutely benefited from, and our middle class lifestyle would not have been possible if it weren't for the exploitation of the people far further down at the base of the pyramid.
It's really easy to see that right in our own society. And I know that we're going to Africa, we're going to every country in the world, and we're taking the resources we want, right? And we pay them something for it, and whether it's worth that or not, I don't know. And so then we're stripping resources out of I guess you're not supposed to say third world countries anymore. You're supposed to say developing countries or developing nations, but and we're actually trying to de-stimulate them from adding value to those resources and just saying, give us the raw stuff and we'll add the value over here and then we'll sell it back to you. So then that's kind of like insidious. But really, when you look at it, I mean, let's say there's 300 million people in Bangladesh that are living on subsistence. What am I creaming off of them? I'm not creaming anything off of them. They're not doing anything. I mean, what is it that I'm getting out of like the bottom of the pyramid?
Well, if you have subsistence farming, you can't really get much out of that. These people don't produce a surplus, which is why the agricultural system has changed in order to deprive them of their rights completely and put those rights, the rights to the land, in the hands of bigger players who do operate in a financial world, who are not just growing for themselves, but they're producing a surplus of goods, and they're also operating in the financial world. They're providing profit streams for the people who provide all the inputs that they rely on. So provided you can raise the level, the scale at which things operate to the point where you can financialize it, then the wealth conveyance comes from the profit streams that are extracted. So if things don't operate at the most basic level, but operate at a higher level than that, you can cream off surpluses, and that's very much what has been done. So a lot of the trading mechanisms, the World Trade Organization and the large international institutions have really had the effect of financializing everything, down, making it so that the lowest level was nevertheless a level that was high enough to be financializable. So really you deprive the whole base of the pyramid of their means of subsistence, of their control over the most basic level of providing for themselves, that level of security where they could say, I have this little bit of land and I will eat whatever I can produce on this land. If you deprive them of that, then they end up working on somebody else's land and hoping that they get given something to eat in return. Or they end up moving to some shanty town, trying to eke out an existence in the heaving mass of humanity with no services that you get building up around all the major cities in the third world. So a whole strata of society in the third world has just been absolutely dispossessed in order to provide for the wealth conveyance potential from the far reaches of the world into the hands of the center. So this is really what globalization is all about. It's about developing the ability to pick the pockets of the whole world rather than just to regard the periphery as the lowest strata of people in your own society. Once the developed countries and the governance model that arose from that really allowed expansion into the furthest corners of the world. This was all about extending the reach of wealth conveyance into the pockets of the very much larger scope of humanity. Then you could build a globalized model that would allow you to assume much greater levels of control over far more people.
So we're talking about picking the pockets, and again, I go back to capital or excess capital, capital that we call wealth, and they've got interest, and they've got dividends, and they got company profits, right? And that's what's picking the pockets, right? Because that's the mechanism. And now the way I see it is like that this wealth is accumulated, and it's such a big mountain that it's ordering these banks to, take this wealth and get someone to borrow me. Get someone to borrow me. So then the banks come up with all these interesting schemes, like the credit card schemes, special mortgages that are enticing to get into student debt. Even foreign aid is all about debt. Everything is operated on debt, and it's not because I need to borrow money and I feel like I want to borrow money, but I mean, a credit card comes into my mailbox every week and says, hey, start spending on here, free interest for a year, or whatever they say. They're pressing it, and sounds too good, right? Or they give a new refinance mortgage or something like that. And so then what I'm saying is this mountain of wealth has actually made the whole world. The financial system of the whole world is based on a structure of debt, structural debt.
Money is lent into existence. Yeah. So it's not like you have to have a pile of savings and then find something to do with it. Money is actually lent into existence. But you're right that engines of credit expansion are critical. If you can get someone to take on debt, then they become one of the engines of credit expansion. And so student debt, as you mentioned, is absolutely one of those.
Yeah, we used to have scholarships, and then we said, well, what the heck, we don't need let's just let them pay it back, right?
Yeah, you entice people to get into debt in so many ways. So student debt is one. Things like cash for clunkers was an inducement, a $4,000 inducement to get $20,000 into debt. And giving people a contribution to a mortgage down payment is an $8,000 inducement to get $200,000 or more into debt. So it's encouraging people to keep the Ponzi scheme going, to keep the credit expansion Ponzi scheme moving forward. Because if it can't move forward, it will collapse. This is what bubbles always do. They either grow or they implode. And we've had an enormous amount of credit growth. Subprime lending was a huge part of this. Go and talk to the people who have the least money, but get them into debt. Get them to take on obligations. Get them servicing debt if they possibly can. They probably can't do it for very long. But what happened, of course, in the subprime cases was that the banks that organized the mortgages, they got paid a fee up front for organizing the loan. And whether that loan could ever be repaid was not their problem because they sold the risk on to investors in Wall Street through securitization. So securitization is a huge engine of credit expansion. It's much easier to arrange loans if you are not carrying the risk. If the risk can be spread to many more people, then you can go out there and arrange the most ridiculous loans and never have to worry personally about whether they can ever be repaid. But this has happened in so many ways. So fractional reserve banking is a huge engine of credit expansion. Securitization is another, the development of the shadow banking system, all the encouragement inducements to get into student debt. Everything has kept the Ponzi scheme going. But the problem is, with any credit expansion, you reach the point where the income streams of the productive economy can no longer service the debt that has been created. And at that point, the game is over. You no longer have willing borrowers and lenders. The borrowers cannot borrow more. The lenders are no longer minded to lend anymore because when mechanisms like securitization are broken, they know they won't be able to sell the risk on to somebody else. So the risk would rest with them. They're not interested in taking that risk.
Right, they couldn't possibly do that. Well, what I'm trying to ask, I guess, is if there was less wealth, would there be less impetus to rush toward debt? In other words, because we try to make more wealth. Okay, like I saw Warren Buffett on the Charlie Rose show. And he actually just brought his tax returns. And he said, okay, well, capital gains is 15%. When you add up all my stuff, this one year I took 60 million or whatever I took for the annual, you know, he might have made billions, but he just took 60 million. And he says, it all added up to 17% I paid taxes. And then I went into my office, and the lowest guy paid 32%, the highest guy 41%. So it was like 36%. I did 17, and and the average of my people, my staff, was double me, you know. And so then that's just our idea that wealth should be, wealth is important. But really, what if we switched it and said that the taxes on wealth, on interest were, you know, well, we could switch it and just say they're 30% and labor tax is 15%, or we could just somehow equalize it and see how it works. I mean, and then there'd be less wealth.
We don't have that power.
Yeah.
Because the power has accrued to big capital. So returns to capital increase enormously at the peak of very large bubbles. You end up with increasing returns to capital and decreasing returns to labor. It's happened many, many times in the past. And over time that will reverse, but not because we suddenly realized that wasn't a good idea. Because things fundamentally change. Because the system is broken. The system that delivers all the extra claims to wealth into the hands of the very wealthy eventually is broken. When the bubble bursts, you end up in a period where the wealth conveyors don't work anymore. So you don't have the ability to continue creaming off surpluses in the way that you did. What did you call it? The wealth conveyance from the periphery to the center.
Yeah.
When you disrupt the system sufficiently, you break the wealth conveyors. In other words, the things that made the people at the top wealthy, primarily the ability to send wealth towards the center from the periphery.
Well, it's ownership, isn't it?
Well, when you disrupt the ability to concentrate wealth in that way, you have a huge concentration gradient, wealth and poverty. When you can no longer constantly shove wealth uphill, then it's going to start moving downhill. And eventually...
Or is it just going to dissolve?
Well,
because all the paper stuff is going to dissolve, right?
Of course. A lot of it is excess claims to underlying real wealth that will simply cease to have any value at all. But what happens over the longer term, a period of a bubble, it's nature's great wealth redistribution mechanism. So you have a period where you have more and more returns to capital, greater and greater wealth disparities. That actually gets worse in the first phase of the decline when the people with liquidity buy up everyone else's assets for pennies on the dollar. But thereafter, because the wealth conveyance mechanisms are broken and you end up with a huge amount of conflict, because when people have nothing left to lose, they lose it, then you find that your people at the top of the pyramid eventually end up at the wrong end of a pitchfork. And there's an enormous amount of wealth destruction, and then you start the cycle again. So this has happened many, many times in human history. But we don't have the ability to sit there at the top and simply say, well, we're going to do things differently. We're going to change all the tax rates.
Well, we can change some, can't we? Can't we make some adjustments? I mean, they do adjust taxes, but is it always for the wealth and never, 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 ever for society?
It depends who's controlling the basis for making the rules. At the moment, big capital writes the rules. There's been a complete regulatory
Aren't we supposed to vote, though?
capture.
I mean, if people ever got off their complacency and voted, would it ever make a difference, or impossible? They'd block it somehow. It'd always be blocked, right?
It would be, because you can't... Basically, what we have is not democracy. We only have the potential to vote for things that make no difference anyway. Politics at the moment, party politics, is nothing more than prole feed. It's bread and circuses. It's political theater. So we think we're voting for things, but in fact, the policies don't change no matter who is in power, because it's not the politicians who write the policies. There's been a complete regulatory capture of the government regulatory mechanisms by big capital. So, for instance, people from Goldman Sachs go into the U.S. Treasury, rewrite banking law, and then go back into Goldman Sachs and exploit the loopholes they just wrote into the law. And this is happening on a wide range of fronts. You get people working for companies like Monsanto, who then end up being in control of the Food and Drug Administration or being major consultants to it, controlling the regulation of their own industry. So what you have is the foxes looking after the hen house absolutely everywhere at the moment. Now, that won't persist forever. That's been the increasing dynamic during the bubble years, an increasing control at the center, but in a way that sows the seeds of its own destruction. So that control will, such as it is, will be lost over the next few decades. and we'll equalize to something at a very, very much lower level. Not equalize completely, but a lot more so than now, but at a very, very much lower level of
Yeah, I can see that change happening, but it's very destructive. And that was kind of like the basis of my question last night, because I asked, couldn't some small country lead the way and somehow pass some laws that made sense? Like, for instance, you can save seeds or something like that, or no GMOs allowed, because they're talking about that in a lot of countries, or so, which would mean patented seeds, back onto seeds. But I mean, they could also maybe make some kind of a parallel banking system. Okay, you could take the federal insurance, FDIC, away from banks and put it in just a federal credit union, and all the money would migrate. What money? Just the personal family wealth would migrate into this federal credit union. And then let those guys speculate how they want. And then maybe you could move. I mean, I'm really just talking now. I don't have any clue if these things could happen. And maybe in a small country they could. But I mean, then you could say, okay, like some kind of a parallel currency, right? You know, something that wouldn't be speculated with. Something else, you know. I mean, even Gaddafi tried it, right? He was trying to make gold dinars, right? And some other kind of a currency that wouldn't be speculated with. It wouldn't be pumped up, wouldn't be part of bubble economies.
Small countries may have greater freedom to do certain things, especially if they're isolated, like where we are here in New Zealand. The interesting thing is you have the combination of isolation and a relatively small scale. So the population here is only somewhat over 4 million people, and it is 2 small islands in the middle of the Pacific. What you can do here in terms of doing things differently may well be greater freedom to do that over time. But it will be at the cost of being unplugged from the global economy, which I believe you will be in New Zealand at some point. Because what ends up happening in periods of depression is trade relationships end up breaking down very significantly. Right now, New Zealand is very plugged into the global economy for imports and exports. I believe it will not be anywhere near so plugged into the global economy in a future where there's a lot less trade, for obvious reasons. So then it will have to be an awful lot more self-sufficient. That used to be its approach prior to the 1980s. It did have a self-sufficiency ethos to it. I think it will go back to that again. And that may well involve different forms of financing, different forms of money. They may try to do things different here, and it might well be an interesting laboratory of what is possible at a relatively small scale. It's going to be much harder where the scale is huge.
Well,
like
it's not necessarily much harder, but it's much harder to make the change and transition into it. In other words, my view is like if a small country can prove, like a beta test, that, hey, this is really working, then a big country could take some risky step, which would be considered too risky. Just to go out and do it. And someone else has already learned by their mistakes, let's say. That's what I'm saying.
Well, it's simply much more difficult when you're operating at a much larger scale to be able to be truly creative and make something work. Because the things that really have the best chance of working in a disrupted future are going to be the things that develop from the bottom up at very, very small scale. So if you're working in a small country, things can be scaled up from the bottom up to actually reach something approximating the scale of the small country. But if you're trying to scale up from the very grassroots to the size of the United States, you have a lot bigger job to do. So it's not a question of from the top down recrafting the regulatory model. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the central authorities, ultimately the center will not be able to hold. And the system as it exists is very likely to fall, because trust will be withdrawn, political legitimacy will disappear, society will be very polarized. Things that attempt to work at a large scale, I don't think will work very well. They're very sclerotic and bureaucratic, full of inertia, hostage to vested interests. I don't regard top-down political structures as being fundamentally reformable, but the grassroots initiatives that could emerge could easily be things like complementary currencies that are not debt-based, time banking, means of scaling up economic exchanges in ways that do not involve the creation of debt, that do not involve the level of central control that our current monetary mechanisms really endow the center with. So I think many, many things will be tried, and the smaller the scale you operate at, the better the odds. But it very much helps if you're doing things at a small scale where you're not then simply going to be crushed by the center. where the center is not so enormous that it can simply squash whatever
Well, that's
initiatives you
what the
try and
center
take.
could do. We're saying that the center doesn't have the power to be innovative on all these different levels of all these different necessities, but it does have the power to take off the pressure to say, hey, you can't do anything different down there. And it can kind of relax a lot of regulatory rules that are, that are based on very small actions, you know, individual actions, family actions, and community actions. Okay, they need regulatory things for the major, you know, for the utilities and for all the companies that have no competition.
Well, essentially the problem is that anything that operates at a large scale is never going to do that, because it owes its very existence to the ability to convey wealth from the periphery to the center. This is the fundamental raison d'etre of larger political systems, or well, political systems at all scales, but certainly the larger ones. They are never going to threaten their own existence by putting control in the hands of the very bottom of the pyramid. This would undercut their ability to survive in the way that they define as being essential. So you are never going to see them do that. The highest level of government that I think you could actually expect to see remove barriers to people looking after themselves is really municipal government. Anything much larger than that, and it's too much of a threat to the existence of the system. Now, if you live in a very small country that's relatively isolated, you might be able to scale things up further than merely the municipal. But even so, it is very difficult to look to central government, even at a relatively small scale, and ask it to permit and even facilitate decentralization initiatives, even although this is exactly the way to get the largest number of people through a bottleneck, because they do not exist to ensure that the largest number of people get through a bottleneck. They exist to maintain their own position in the hierarchy. They are not going to want to take a cut in their standard of living. They're going to try and maintain their position. And as the amount of wealth, the claims on wealth are diminishing, they are going to squeeze harder. So they're actually, if anything, going to strengthen means to try and extract control from the periphery. This is exactly what Rome did, for instance, in the era of Diocletian. So there'd been an erosion of the power of the center. And under Diocletian, Rome strengthened the role of the center enormously with an incredibly repressive, intrusive tax regime that set limits, set tithes. Everyone who had this much of land had to contribute a certain amount to the center, whether they had a bad crop year or not, whether that left them anything whatsoever to live on themselves or not. And if somebody couldn't make up their share, the rest of the community was on the hook to make up the difference. So this was actively beggaring the periphery in the most repressive way to try and maintain the power of the center that was the Roman Empire at that time. Eventually, the peasants realized that they were better off with the barbarians, and they abandoned their land in droves and simply left. And of course, then the center could not hold. So I think we're looking at an era where the center will try very, very hard to squeeze the people at the base of the pyramid for absolutely everything they're worth until it doesn't work anymore. But places like New Zealand, and there are other isolated parts of the world as well, may simply be rather beyond their grip. So if there is an opportunity to do things differently in places like this, it will be because you are beyond the grip of that taxation kind of regime. So you can't squeeze somebody that you can't reach. So it depends what the reach ends up being. In an era when there's a lot less energy, the reach may not possibly extend this far. The ability to project power at a distance is a function of the available energy. So there may be places that are more isolated that don't end up being squeezed, that may be able to do things fundamentally differently. But the more connected you are to the system, the harder it is. So for instance, if you look at the difference between Iceland and Greece, Iceland was able to tell the bankers to go away because Iceland is a rock in the middle of the Atlantic with 300,000 people and some sheep, and it has a really big moat. So you can't effectively go and asset strip it, whereas in Greece you can. We're going to see the European periphery asset strip. That's exactly what's going on at the moment. So this is a form of the great collateral grab, if you like. There are too many claims, not enough wealth to go round. The people who own the claims, who understand the rules of the game and know that there are too many claims, not enough real assets, are saying to Greece, for instance, impose austerity, cut all the payments, public sector payments, raise all your taxes, sell us islands, sell us the Parthenon, sell us all your productive infrastructure. In other words, they're trying to press their claim on the real physical assets because it's obvious that Greece can't pay.
But we've
its
done
debts.
that with Africa and with all kinds of South America, Central America for years and years and years, right?
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, I mean, is that only the fact that they're trying to hold the euro together? If they abandon the euro and go to the drachma, they could say, go to hell, we're not selling you nothing.
I think that would actually be better. However, it would cause tremendous upheaval in the short term. And the politicians who brought it in would be absolutely crucified by their own population.
If not murdered.
Exactly. So they're not going to commit what would be certainly political suicide and quite possibly physical suicide as well. Because although it's inevitable that they will end up leaving the Eurozone, and this is going to happen anyway, if you precipitate the crisis, then people will blame you for it personally.
Forever.
So they will not say, oh, well, it was going to happen anyway, and it's better to take the pain now because if we only wait later, it's going to be worse. People don't think that way. They think, no, you, Mr. Politician, you voted for this right now. Therefore, what has just happened is all your fault. So politicians just desperately try and kick the can down the road into somebody else's term of office and see if they can hold it together, even if they know perfectly well they're only making it worse later. Personally, I think the best thing would be for Greece to default sooner rather than later, go back to new drachmas, and simply take the nasty medicine up front, to not be connected into the system in the way that they currently are, because that might well prevent them being asset stripped. They might well get to keep more local control of the asset base in their own country. But this would be horribly painful nonetheless, because they wouldn't be able to borrow internationally anymore. The government spends far more than it gets in tax revenues because tax evasion is a national sport. And so you would end up in a situation where it would be almost impossible to be able to fund the lifestyle that people recognize, even although it's much diminished in comparison to what it was. You couldn't maintain anything close to what it is now if you were working on new drachmas. New drachmas would not be a hard currency, a convertible currency. They would be worth nothing outside the country. You wouldn't be able to pay for imports unless you had something to export that would generate hard currency. So this would be an enormous constraint on your ability to import anything. It would force self-sufficiency. Now, ultimately, self-sufficiency is a good thing, but getting there can be acutely painful.
But so is Greece at all anywhere close to self-sufficiency? When we talked about New Zealand, we said that New Zealand is very much dependent on trade. And so then there's no energy, no, Japan has no energy. I mean, these people have to trade.
Well, yes, the trade dependency is very extreme in a lot of places. Greece does have to trade, but they would be able to grow a certain amount of food. They would certainly end up with vastly less energy. They would not have the hard currency to purchase the energy that they use. So they would have tremendous problems in maintaining anything that relies on fossil fuels, which is an awful lot of their infrastructure. So the pain of adjusting to, making a very rapid adjustment to a much lower energy lifestyle would be huge. I mean, look at Cuba and North Korea as being two countries that lost their energy supply very, very quickly. Greece would find it had the same kind of enormous adjustment that those countries have faced. Personally, I think they would handle it more like Cuba did than North Korea, which is a fundamentally positive thing, because Cuba did handle it. But the pain was enormous in the short term, and I think the pain in Greece would be huge too. And Greece operates at a large enough scale that there would be tremendous destruction of things that operate at too large a scale to operate without fossil fuels. So it would be a collapse of socioeconomic complexity from their perspective. There would probably be outright revolution and civil war. So what's coming for Greece is going to be absolutely horribly unpleasant, whether they take the nasty medicine now or whether they keep the system going as long as they possibly can. inevitably the scale of political upheaval there is going to be staggeringly large, and the pain that people will be facing will be huge. And I think they're only the canary in the coal mine as far as Europe is concerned. I think that same dynamic is going to spread initially around much of the European periphery, but increasingly into the European core, where there are also enormous housing bubbles, over-leveraged banking systems, banks that are enormously disproportionate to the size of their host economy, and a banking system that's incredibly interconnected, so that when you have defaults in the periphery, you crash the banking system at the center as well, even if you're Germany, because their banking system has funded everybody else's housing bubble. So Europe is looking at something really quite disastrous. And the estimate has been that if the single currency fails, which I think is inevitable, then the impact would be between 20 and 50% of GDP in the first year, depending on whether you're a country at the center or a country at the periphery. But that's an absolutely enormous impact. And this would be happening in a place with a 1,000-year history of conflict, where already the recriminations are building up between places like Germany and Greece, for instance. But the potential for inflaming tensions in Europe, pre-existing tensions that go back hundreds and hundreds of years, that potential is absolutely enormous. So Europe, I think, is facing what could be quite tragic circumstances. And I'm European. I feel this very personally, that this is something that is taking Europe in a direction that is unavoidable, but is going to be horribly painful. And unfortunately, the way Europe has come together with the single currency and this fundamentally flawed monetary architecture, it has really made this kind of conflagration inevitable, and that is simply so incredibly tragic.
I want to go back a little bit, and just for a bit, and visit that we said, okay, the infrastructure is horribly lacking, right? And so that we're talking about systems that were made in Victorian times, maybe water and sewer and so on. And so then capital is needed to fix these systems up, right? And so we honor capital. But somehow what we found is that when capital goes beyond national capital or local capital and it becomes international capital, it doesn't have any interest in these infrastructures, and in fact it's trying to arbitrage, labor and just arbitrage something else that I would call gifts. In other words, like an international holding company that buys a factory in a city, the first thing they're going to do is close it. Right? Because then they're going to look for another town that's going to take that factory and say, okay, we'll give you tax holidays, we'll give you free land, we'll give you, we'll give you so many things, come to us. And right, and so then they'll have a brand new top of the line factory built that's not obsolete, and then they won't have any labor unions, and then international capital in that sense is very counter society, counter civilization, and
it's parasitic and predatory. And the interest of big capital is to increase the returns to big capital.
But that's international capital, right? Big national capital. I mean, if a company owns lots of companies in Chicago, they're going to want the services in Chicago to be good. They're going to want the police protection to be good. They're going to want the education to be good. They're going to want everything, and because they're local, based in the Chicago. I'm just from Chicago, so I'll say that for an example. But once they get to be in 50 cities, then they're going to just kind of shuffle around and say, okay, we'll buy something here, but we're closing it down. It's
well, that's exactly true. It's a function of scale again. So when you scale things up, then capital ends up being divorced from any kind of local resource base.
From society, basically. It will
absolutely stop caring about the fundamental infrastructure and the structure of society. The problem is that, of course, ultimately it does depend on these things. If enough infrastructure ends up being degraded and destroyed widely enough, and populations in the fabric of society get disrupted enough, then they won't have anywhere that they can operate where they can still function effectively. So they do sow the seeds of their own destruction when they do that. But that's very much where we've gone. We've scaled everything up to the point where there is no local connection. There is no reason for them to care. about local infrastructure at all. It's just about being a predator by going into a community and taking it for all it's worth and then moving on to somewhere else where the opportunities are greater. It's all about seeking the greatest, most profitable opportunities. And we have built this system in scaling up. I think the solutions really lie in things operating at a human scale again. This is really why I talk a lot about decentralization. It's about learning to operate again at a local scale, trying to reestablish local control over the essentials if we possibly can, operating at a scale that requires caring about local infrastructure and the fabric of society locally, a scale where you are part of the social system, not above it and separate from it. So in scaling everything up to the extent that we have done, which was only possible because of our fossil fuel discoveries, in scaling things up to that extent, we have fundamentally severed that connection between the owners of capital and the connections with local communities. This is really what has allowed so much profitability to emerge, but at the same time has very much caused it to sow the seeds of its own destruction over time, because there is so much that is being damaged. The fabric of society, all the infrastructure, the basis on which everything rests is being fundamentally damaged. So we're consuming our natural capital in so many ways. And you could think of the era of the credit bubble, the last 30 years, as being the giant hollowing out of society. It goes back roughly to the point where energy per capita peaked at a global level. So from that time, what we did is we expanded our reach spatially with globalization, so we could pick the pockets of the whole world. We also expanded it temporally. In other words, we borrowed from the future by creating debt and hollowed out our structures. So we've been actively consuming the soil fertility that would allow us to feed ourselves in decades' time. We've been consuming the energy resources and everything else, the fossil water supplies. We really have been depleting non-renewable resources of every kind at an incredibly rapid rate. So we've hollowed out our system, and we're in the future, when we've had our large undershoot and we're trying to recover, we're going to be facing acute resource shortages of all kinds. We'll have lowered our carrying capacity. We'll be facing acute resource shortages, and that will place a very hard ceiling on what level we can hope to recover to. So when we have some kind of recovery, it's not going to look like business as usual. We're not getting back up to this again, this kind of society again. Fossil fuels are a once in a planet's lifetime deal, or at least once in the lifetime of the human species at the very least. So we are never going to reach these heights again. We're never going to have the energy to create and maintain the level of socioeconomic complexity that we currently enjoy. So we will inevitably be operating at a very much simpler level in the future than we are used to.
It was really interesting last night when you showed the chart of all the different energies and possibilities and how much energy it takes to make that energy, and then the ones that we think, the renewables and all that we have so much hope in, really are so small on the scale that it looks like it could never really. You're almost saying that the transition would take 50 years or 100 years, and it's whatever new could happen, it never could really be effective to change much.
Well, it can't replace what we currently have. You don't run industrial societies on renewable energy with a very, very low energy return on energy invested. It doesn't give you enough of an energy surplus to allow you to supply what we currently have. So you have to demand has to be drastically lower before you can attempt to supply it with low energy return on energy invested sources, whether they're renewable or whether they're unconventional fossil fuels like shale gas, for instance, or tar sands. All of these things have a very low energy return on energy invested. So that they're really not an energy source from the point of view of our current society that requires a higher energy surplus, a higher energy return on energy invested in order to maintain its level of socioeconomic complexity. So you can run something on smaller, simpler sources with a much less surplus, but it won't look anything like the society we have today. And I think we're going to be bringing renewables online, not in technologically complex, large-scale ways. These are the ways people are contemplating right now. These are fundamentally flawed because they lower the net energy even further because of the build-in of an infrastructure requirement. I think we'll be doing things at a very, very small, simple local scale. So I think we might see, if we see biofuels, then it'll be ethanol produced on a farm from some crop, like sugar beets, for instance, that actually gives you a decent net energy. If you're doing it on a very small scale, just in order to run some farm equipment, then that's very much like when farmers would have to put aside a quarter of their land to feed the horse that would help them work the rest of it. So you could do that. You could plant a certain amount of your land with something you can turn into ethanol fuel and run your farm equipment on that allows you to work the rest of the land. But it works only at that very small scale. I mean, even things like solar panels, if you put them on your roof where your demand actually is, then there's a lot less of an infrastructure requirement. If you use them to run DC systems so that you don't need an inverter, again, a lower infrastructure requirement. This sort of thing is really the way to do it and get the most out of the kind of technology that is available. Nevertheless, though, there's a major fossil fuel input required for things like photovoltaics or wind power, because we don't make solar panels with solar power or wind turbines with wind power. So if we don't have affordable fossil fuels, we're not producing steel, we're not running the factories that make these things. So as energy, fossil fuel energy gets more expensive, or well, less affordable at whatever price it might be at in nominal terms. But as it gets less and less affordable, renewable energy infrastructure gets less affordable as well. So we have a major dilemma. We can't simply say, oh, provided we run our society on solar panels and wind, then we can just have the exact same society run on different energy sources. It's absolutely a pipe dream to think that you can do that. You can't. You don't have the fossil fuels to build the infrastructure, you don't have the time, you won't have the money, and you can't run power systems on fully intermittent sources anyway. There's a real limit to how much of your power system can be non-dispatchable before you lose control over power quality parameters.
What do you mean fully intermittent? It means like when the sun's out, you get,
yes.
and the wind blows, you get some energy, but then when it doesn't, you don't.
Modern power systems require the majority of the sources of electricity to be dispatchable, so that you can say, we need you now, and now we need you, and so on. Of course, this does rest on the principle that demand is what it is, and you must supply whatever demand is, and you must match demand and supply in real time. I think in the future we won't be doing that anyway. We won't be able to say demand can be whatever it wants to be. We're probably going to be a lot more supply constrained.
Well, new structures, and if there's any money to make renewed structures, I mean, new structures can be even 10%, use 10% of the energy that old structures make, because old structures were so wasteful, and it wasn't a consideration, that energy wasn't that big of a deal.
But then look at the embodied energy in changing your infrastructure. So if you have something that's inefficient, but it nevertheless still works, are you losing more energy by continuing to run your inefficient infrastructure, or by abandoning and looking at embodying a whole lot more energy in something newer? And whatever you build that's newer is going to be more efficient. The ongoing running costs will be less, but the embodied energy in making that conversion is significant as well. So I don't think people look enough at the comparison between the efficiency gain versus the energy embodied in making the shift. You're not necessarily winning.
Yeah, I'm familiar with some engineering companies that do that kind of work, and apparently they can, they can't take an existing structure and only use 10% of the energy it used to, but they can maybe cut it down to 60%, and the payback is only a couple of years, so it does make sense.
Well, you can certainly increase the efficiency of a lot of things without having to replace them.
Right.
But again, it takes time and it takes money, and there's not necessarily going to be enough of either one before we end up in difficulties to really make a significant difference. So I think we're not necessarily going to have anything like the energy efficiency increases we would have hoped for, that would have been physically possible, at least in engineering terms. If we run out of time and money to make the changes, then I think we're far more likely to end up in a period where we have conservation through deprivation rather than efficiency gains. So people won't be running appliances because they can't afford to. So they simply stop using appliances rather than replace an appliance or upgrade its efficiency.
You know, many times the things we talk about are psychological on this, on our discussions. And so psychologically we find that if we have a kind of like a negative thought, we have a bad feeling that goes with it. If we have a positive thought, we feel open, right? And then sometimes looking out at the world, it seems like the only thing you can have is a negative thought, because things aren't all, you know, there's injustice, and there's man's mistreatment of man, and there's mistakes, and there's you know, Holocaust with the nature, you know, tsunamis and so on, and there's you know, we feel like that, we feel scared, right? And so then we do contract and close, and maybe a great skill of humanity would be how to stay open but yet stay effective, because much of the ways we've stayed open are through numbing or ignoring or not paying any attention, and what you said last night, complacency. You know, we hear these things, but we just don't want to hear them, so we just say, screw it. You know, we're not gonna consider, we're gonna concern ourselves with these things. And then, of course, it gets out of hand, and then we are in what you said last night, panic, right? And so then there's these kind of two dynamics we swing between, and nobody's really rational in the middle, actually able to feel the urgencies that are upon us, and actually take positive actions and actually try to live a good life while you're doing it. And I don't know, what can we say about that? Because we've even talked to documentary makers, you know, and they tell a lot of horrific stories, both with justice and both with pollution and both with concentration of power and wealth that is really beyond what we could ever dream or imagine, the injustice of it. But yet, people don't get really effective out of seeing documentaries. What happens mostly is they stop watching documentaries. So how are we going to say a message that's going to be empowering?
Well, basically, it is about creating that third space. So not complacency, not panic, but an informed sense of urgency, and trying to maintain enough of a cushion so that we can maintain a cool head and plan our way through hard times. Of course, it's vastly easier said than done. Human beings are not at all good at being proactive when faced with enormous trend changes. They tend to ride the trend as long as they can and then fall off the cliff with everybody else, and then get very angry along with everybody else, thinking that it's all somebody else's fault. But really, we have built this system, all of us, together. And so we've had this huge bubble created with predatory lenders and willing victims, and this enormous bubble structure that's been built. It is psychological. You know, it starts off with hope and greed, moves into euphoria, and we're just so busy enjoying the ride and the level of material prosperity that it brings us. Those of us that are still lucky enough to be able to ride the trend. Of course, more and more people are falling off the back of the bus all the time, and they're very much not enjoying the ride. They're already in the consequences.
But say a little bit more about how we all built it together, you know, because somehow we've either bought into it or we've ignored the stories that, you know, in other words, because I just want to, I think responsibility is an important ingredient, and not that, and not to go to blame, but just to go to acknowledgement and responsibility, and it's probably a strong foundation for taking positive action. But I mean, what do you mean when you say we've all built this together?
Well, if you don't have both predatory lenders and willing victims, then you don't have a Ponzi scheme. So the people who are being fleeced, who are going to end up being the empty bag holders, end up being absolutely insistent that they be given the empty bag because they think it's so attractive. They're really thinking, you know, this has made so much money for so many people, I want my share. And what happens is people buy into these things and end up being the empty bag holder, the people who are left holding something that ends up being worth nothing. The people who made the money are the ones who got in early, got out early, and were laughing all the way to the bank, while handing over something that's no longer worth anything to people who are only too happy to take it. So there's so many aspects where it is a society-wide phenomena, because things like euphoria as to confidence as to the future are very catching. So on the way up, a lot of people catch them. A lot of people throw caution to the wind. They get themselves in over their heads. They're enjoying the ride as long as it continues. And they like what they're getting from it. So the continuation of the Ponzi scheme is in the interests of the majority for a while it keeps going. But then the trend change happens, and the aftermath isn't in anybody's interests. Everybody ends up losing an enormous amount, and everybody ends up being angry. And what spreads then, because emotions are extremely catching, what spreads then is anger and fear. And you get recriminations and the attempt to force the losses into the laps of others. Anger and fear get tremendous amounts of traction in contractionary times. But what I try to do is to say, look at that for what it is. It's an enormous movement of human herding behavior. You don't have to go in that direction. You don't have to join movements of anger and fear. If you do, you're more part of the problem than part of the solution. It's corrosive of personal psychology. It's corrosive of the fabric of society. What we need to do is recognize human herding behavior for what it is, not be caught up in it, and maintain our focus on the genuinely constructive community building initiatives that we do have within our power. So the small scale things that we can do are within our power. And if we focus on doing those, then we make ourselves a lot better positioned to face the future than we otherwise would be. Other than that, if we're throwing our energy and our emotional intensity into scapegoating, which is very likely to happen for a lot of people, if that's where our resources and our intensity is going, it's not going into the constructive at all. And the problem is that it's going to be very hard to maintain that constructive focus when more and more people are angry and afraid. It's going to take a lot of active effort. It makes a big difference if you start before everything gets really, really difficult. This is what I'm trying to inspire people to do, to be proactive, create the things that will make a genuine difference, that will make the circumstances we're heading for a lot easier to ride out than they would otherwise be.
Is there anything to say how things might look, in another age? I would say that certain common resources should be held in common, and that ownership should not, and the ability to extract rents, which is extract interest and profits, shouldn't be as widespread as it is now. But maybe it could be some different way.
If things are held in common at a local level, then that can work quite well, because they're held in common where the people who are holding them in common know each other, and from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, works well at a very small scale, about 150 people. It's when you try and scale things up that becomes problematic, because people no longer know each other's needs or abilities, so you lose the accountability in the system. It doesn't work to scale up common ownership. With certain exceptions perhaps, but if you try and scale up a common ownership to a national level, and you have central control, what it really means is it's only common ownership in theory. Actually, it's oligarchy. You end up with central control, and then some people are more equal than others. So the whole animal farm dynamic, for instance, ends up, you start with this sense of, throw off the previous masters, now we all own this together, but eventually you just trade one set of masters for another. So when you scale that up, again, it sows the seeds of its own destruction. It doesn't give you what it was designed to give you. It doesn't give you egalitarian access to resources. It doesn't give you equal control. It puts all the control at the center and then leads to an enormous amount of corruption, where connections are everything, the politics of the personal. You start to get something that looks a lot more like the Soviet Union, for instance. I don't think that works. Anything that you scale up far beyond its roots so that it loses connection with its roots is fundamentally not going to last.
So in a way, it's the scale that
Yes.
Needs to be limited in some way, and maybe it's not really ownership or... Yeah, we were just saying the scale of international business, it's gone beyond the community, beyond the nation. And so it's scaled up too much. So scaling is like the detriment.
Yes, and scaling has been a function of our discovery of fossil fuels. So the amount of energy you have in a system determines the level of socioeconomic complexity, the scale, the degree of differentiation, a degree of central control you can maintain over a larger area. It really is energy that gives you that driving force. So in discovering this enormous pool of fossil fuels that were just sitting there waiting to be exploited, we have allowed ourselves to do the most dangerous thing, which is to scale things up to the point where we've completely lost connection with the roots. So we've built the biggest bubble on the back of the fossil fuel era. And now when the adjustment comes, it's going to be far more painful than we've seen before, because we're falling from higher heights. So previous bubbles that have burst, where there wasn't that enormous impetus to drive up towards complexity, to break the connections with the roots, when previous bubbles had burst, it wasn't so far to fall. This time, collectively, we're looking at falling out of the top floor of a 100-floor building. And if you're going to fall out of a window, how much it hurts when you hit the ground depends how many floors up you were at the time. So we've managed to climb to a higher floor than any other previous society did. And what I'm trying to do is to get people to put on a parachute and jump rather than wait to be shoved, because then there's some chance you might get to the bottom in one piece. But it's difficult. It's very hard to get people to take steps like that proactively. Personally, I think it's really the only thing we can do. So I think it's what we certainly should be doing. And I'm trying to inspire people to do exactly that. But it is always going to be difficult to get people to take actions that change their lives very radically.
Yeah, and I mean, we've all tried a little bit, at least the people I know, of having a garden, of supporting a community agriculture, of trying to buy local, but it's cheaper to buy, somehow it's not that easy just to switch over 100%, and not very many of us really want to go to subsistence living or to live out in nature, and so we can start to enjoy our connections even more, because maybe they won't be, and just try to talk to people about these problems and see how we can be active together. And
it is about pooling resources and acting together, building relationships of trust, because anything we do together builds social capital, it builds relationships of trust, and that's simply the foundation of society at all times. Things will scale up to the level the trust can support. When you scale beyond that, that's when you get into trouble.
So fascinating, Nicole. Tell us a little bit about your website and how it's organized, and like some of the activities that you're, what are the focuses that you're taking to?
Well, it's called The Automatic Earth, and the URL is theautomaticearth.org. It's a new site. We used to have a blog spot, so the new site has a lot more functionality. We're trying to cover the news of the day. We write features every other day or every third day. We also have commentaries on aspects of the news of the day in whatever field we think is relevant. We are building a lifeboat section where we're trying to bring together knowledge that people have in lots of different parts of the world as to what's working, what can you do.
Does that mean Time Bank? Is that what you mean by that?
Time Bank is one initiative that you could discuss in a lifeboat section. But the lifeboat section is just about how do you look after yourself in all the myriad different ways you would have to do that. How do you provide for the essentials of your own existence? And so time banking would be under money, but we would also look at shelter and food and water and community, and all kinds of different initiatives are part of the lifeboat section. We're just trying to get that off the ground and to build that now. We also have our primer section where there's the collection of essays that are our distilled worldview, if you like. We have we sell DVDs of the material that I develop, so we're putting information out there. We have that available on our website, and there'll be new DVDs coming fairly soon. They're in production at the moment. So there's a lot of information there. There's links to all the media appearances that we've done, anything that's available online, written interviews, video interviews. So there's a great deal of material out there that we're trying to share with as many people as we possibly can. And there are 3 of us at the moment who are running the site. There's myself, my writing partner, Raul Ilagi Meyer, and then Ashwin Pandarangi, an American student who's working with us at the moment. So there's the three of us who are running the site, and we're simply trying to spread the message as widely as we can, reach as many people, and hopefully inspire as many people as possible to take that step to create a lifestyle that will actually be able to be maintained in hard times.
Well, terrific, Nicole. I hope we can keep a relationship going with you, and
that should be possible.
Get people to see what you're up to. And fantastic, interesting times we're living in, and actually there's something we can do about it, you know, and besides close our eyes and pretend we're spiritual. So let's let's enjoy these times and enjoy the challenge we have to live this life, and enjoy the possibility that we can bequeath future generations at least a startup on trying to fix a few of the bugaboos that we've created, and take responsibility and move off of blame, and see what can happen together. So thanks for watching this. Nicole Foss, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.